The modern idea of Italian food is one of artisan abundance. We think of fresh pasta, wood-fired pizza, and expensive truffles served in a setting of effortless gastronomic perfection. But for much of the 20th century, the reality was the opposite. During the years of wartime collapse, Italian families were picking through the rubble of destroyed buildings in the dead of winter, searching for anything they could use to survive. On these city sidewalks, lines of exhausted people stretched for blocks. Official food supplies had slowed to a trickle, and eventually they stopped altogether, leaving millions of people with no legal way to find their next meal. When the shelves went empty, people began looking for alternatives in the shadows. This created a secret, illegal trade, an underground market where ordinary citizens met in dark alleyways to exchange money for hazardous, repulsive scraps that would be considered trash in any other era. Looking at what was actually traded on these tables shows how quickly the biological drive to stay alive can override a person's sense of law, safety, or even basic human disgust. In the early stages of the famine, the black market focused on imitation. Real coffee had become a luxury only the wealthy could afford, so secret workshops began roasting acorns, chickpeas, and barley until they were charred enough to look like coffee beans. This historical display shows the scale of that scarcity. That tiny 30-gram bowl was labeled ersatz coffee. It was bitter, smoky, and contained no caffeine, yet workers still lined up in the freezing cold before dawn just to buy a few grams of it. Holding a warm cup in the morning served a purpose beyond nutrition. For a few minutes, it allowed a person to pretend their world hadn't collapsed, that life was still somewhat normal. We see the same effort in survival cakes. Parents would search the black market for treats made from spoiled flour and old cooking oil. They were often dangerous to eat, but they were the only way to give a child a single moment of a holiday celebration. Consuming these fake foods was as much about psychology as it was about calories. It was an attempt to maintain a sense of human dignity when everything else was being stripped away. This rationing card, a Carta Honoraria Individuale, proved the government's failure. The promised calories weren't enough to keep a body functioning. Coupons for grassi, fats, were useless in empty shops, forcing the trade of staples like butter entirely into the illegal underground. Stolen potatoes became a high-stakes currency. Farm raids were common, and families who managed to get a sack of potatoes would hide them inside their walls or under floorboards, knowing that thieves were everywhere. This scarcity forced people to accept physical dangers they would have previously avoided. In port cities, dock workers bought rotting sardines that were technically unsafe. They washed them in vinegar to hide the smell of decay, risking violent illness just to have something to eat. Long-term hunger changes how a person views danger. When the alternative is starvation, eating something toxic starts to feel like a necessary gamble. Eventually, even the imitation foods disappeared. In mountain villages, people began trading animal blood. It was collected during butchering and mixed with stale bread to make a heavy, dark soup. Parents told their children it was medicine to get them to drink it. In the cities, sellers collected the fat and bone scraps left on butcher shop floors after closing time. They boiled these remnants into thick stews sold in narrow alleys. At this stage of the famine, people stopped asking what animal the meat came from. In some regions, villagers sought out spoiled cheese that was intentionally hidden underground until it was filled with insects. They ate it because the movement inside the cheese represented a source of protein they couldn't find anywhere else. Families foraged for weeds and grass along the roadsides, boiling them for hours to remove the bitterness. Some of these plants caused sickness and hallucinations, but they were eaten in silence because they provided physical mass in the stomach. When pushed to this limit, the body stops negotiating. True famine removes curiosity and replaces it with a singular focus on staying alive until the next morning. The most desperate trade involved the very thing we associate with Italian life: bread. When real flour became impossible to find, underground bakers mixed tiny amounts of grain with wood dust, crushed husks, and bark powder to create these dense, heavy blocks. This bread was painful to chew and dangerous to digest, but people bought it every day because holding a loaf of bread, even one made of wood, made survival feel possible. These photographs remind us that the people in these markets were ordinary parents, workers, and children. They were people who had been forced by circumstance to eat things that we would consider repulsive today. It shows us how quickly the rules of a civilization can change. Manners and laws are easy to follow when food is abundant, but they become secondary when the most basic human need is no longer met. History is at its most terrifying when we realize how close we are to these same instincts. If your family hadn't eaten in days, what would you be willing to put on your table?